Yeah, that's right. I do believe far right and the far left can be equally insane, and because neither party has a monopoly on virtue or vice, and both parties have increasingly been catering to their outer limits. I mean, one of the things that's happened is that the power in politics has moved from the center to the extremes, to the fringes, and that's created a really destructive dynamic. One of the things that happens when parties get more polarized is we start to see this ideological absolutism, this hunt for heretics, as I call it. And it's in the Republican Party, it's called rhino hunting. And a rhino is called a Republican in name only. And in the Democratic Party, you've got, it's still an amateur sport, but it's growing in popularity, dino hunting, Democrat in name only. And basically what this is a party purge. This is about ideological purity, and it is about driving anyone out of the party that doesn't agree with you 100% of the time. In the case of the Republican Party, it's an attempt to drive out folks who are not both fiscally conservative and socially conservative. But it creates a very destructive dynamic. It stamps out dissent. It reverses a lot of the things we hope to see in our politics. We supposedly identify and elevate courage. But what the Wingnuts and the extremes believe is that if you are a good party man, if you vote with your party 100% of the time, that means you're courageous. Well, of course, that's not courage, that's cowardice, that's conformity. But everything gets upside down in the topsy-turvy world of the Wingnuts.
So we were talking about this just prior to us coming here, this idea of groupthink.
Yeah.
Really is how you bring people into this tent.
That's exactly right, and it's a big problem. It is group polarization is one of the primary fights of our time. You can analyze not just American politics, but current world politics as a struggle between freedom and fundamentalism in the broadest sense. And one of the things you see is that the way that extremist groups recruit is actually the same. It is the same dynamic, whether you're talking about a cult, a terrorist cell, or an extreme political wing. Because what they do is they try to bring like-minded people together. They try to pair people off from the rest of society and get them in a group of like-minded individuals. And they try to incite them and radicalize them by pushing out anyone who dares disagree even a little bit.
That's a pretty serious comparison to say that some of these right and left-wing political groups sort of mirror the same sort of recruiting dynamic as a terrorist group or a cult.
Yeah, and I want to be very clear. There is no moral equivalence at all between Wingnuts in American politics and terrorism. Many people in this city, we experience terrorism personally, and we take it personally. But the dynamic we are indulging has some of the same traits. An attempt to try to radicalize people, an attempt to try to separate them from society and incite them to ever-increasing feats of extremism, and to separate them from the rest of society by saying they have special knowledge and it's the rest of society that's corrupt or weak. That's a dynamic that's as old as the hills, and it's usually very destructive. We know this story doesn't end well, and that's why it's worth confronting the extremes. That's the message of this book, is that we need to confront the extremes on both sides to stop this cycle before it results in
just on that particular point, buried deep in the book, you cite an old belief that leaders of the extremist groups like to dumb down the rhetoric to the point where everybody else there believes that they are as smart as the leader that they're following.
It's an old sign of the demagogue, yes. Yeah. It's the secret of the demagogue. It's an old quote, but that the secret of the demagogue is to make his audience believe that they are as clever as he, while simultaneously kind of lowering the bar. And you can look, partly it's economic downturns are always boom times for demagogues, and that's partly what we see. We see a rise in extreme politics whenever there's an economic downturn, because people are looking for something to blame. They're looking for an outlet for their anger and their anxiety. And what the demagogue always does is he comes up and he says, I've got a great person to blame. It's the other. And whenever somebody comes preaching simple solutions to complex problems and blaming the other, watch out. Yeah. Bad times ahead.
Yeah, you say it's a perfect political storm primed for a return to pitchfork politics.
It is, and we've seen these folks before. I mean, that's important. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, we had Father Charles Coughlin on the right and Huey Long on the left. We've seen the antecedents of today's Wingnuts at various times with varying degrees of violence. I mean, we experienced in the late 1960s, early 1970s. People forget that a lot of the far left activist groups. We traced down in doing research for this book more than 1,000 cases of shootings, arsons, and bombings from the far left in one period of American history. And then, of course, we all know more recently the violence that came out of the militia movement in the 1990s.
Do you think Wingnuts today are more dangerous than they were in decades past?
I do, because they've increased their prominence and their credibility. I think there are three reasons why today's Wingnuts are more dangerous than folks we've seen before. First of all, Wingnuts are sometimes dismissed as the eccentric color on the fringes of the political landscape. Sort of harmless, and in some cases they are. But three things have made them more dangerous than ever before, and more powerful than ever before. One, the polarization of the parties. The parties are more polarized than ever before. It's not just your imagination, folks. Washington, if you used to look at voting patterns in Congress, the power was clustered in the center of Congress. Well, now it's in the extremes. What that does is that increases the influence of folks on the extremes. We've had a rigged system of redistricting in this country, which has also moved power from the center to the margins. Folks are trying to get elected in supposedly safe seats where there's no general election in a closed partisan primary with a 10% turnout, which is entirely realistic. 5.1% makes a majority. Second thing is the polarization of the partisan media. Increasingly, we're kind of devolving back to the era where newspapers used to be owned by political parties, except now it's radio stations, television stations, as well as newspapers. And then finally, the really new thing under the sun is the internet. The internet has, in some cases, become an incubator for extremism. It's become a method by which people recruit and radicalize, where people talk to each other all day long and incite each other to greater extremes. And it's enabled something where we're self-segregating ourselves into separate political realities. And that can be very dangerous.
Let's talk more about the media and the internet in the few minutes ahead. But let's first of all identify and get you to explain two syndromes that you talk about in the book. Bush derangement syndrome, obviously, which was first formed during the Bush administration, and now Obama derangement syndrome. What are they? How did they? What gave rise to them, and how are they manifest in today's political climate?
It is an apparently contagious political virus. Bush derangement syndrome and Obama derangement syndrome now, I define as pathological hatred of the president posing as patriotism. And it's important to understand the interplay between the extremes. Because neither side is immune from this. In the Bush years, what do we see? We saw people, some protesters, not maybe a lot, but definitely there, and some very prominent ones, comparing President Bush to Hitler, calling him a tyrant, a terrorist. And this just wasn't placards in protest. One of the things I detail in the book, there's a surprising line of Nobel Prize winners who were comparing Bush to Hitler and the Bush administration to fascists. And they didn't get a lot of condemnation. And, politics follows the lines of physics. Every action creates an equal and opposite reaction. And one of the things, whenever I interview someone at a protest carrying an Obama is Hitler sign, invariably they say well, they started it. They called our guy Hitler first, and I didn't see anyone complaining, so now we're just getting back at him. So the extremes do incite each other. But now what I think we've seen with Obama is something that's even more prevalent. It's metastasized in our body politic much quicker. The Obama resistance was announced on literally day one, I detail in my book. The websites came out calling for the Obama resistance. We saw a major uptick in death threats against the president right after Election Day through his first quarter. It was at a much higher level than previously. And of course, as we followed the protests last year, I think it's very important to say that the Tea Party protests I do not consider a wingnut movement at all. But I think there are two main strains going on. One, you've got a principled fiscal conservative protest in reaction to bailouts and unprecedented budget deficits. But then you've got the folks who suffer from serious cases of Obama derangement syndrome. And they, over the course of the summer in particular, as conservative activists, ironically, started riffing off Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals and embracing, street theater confrontation politics. Obama derangement syndrome became prevalent, and it degrades our discourse.
So there was, and I'm not going to say that it was across the political spectrum, but there did seem to be a moment right around the election where the country became unified around this idea of something completely different in the political spectrum when President Obama was elected. What happened?
We were young ones. It is amazing to look back at the 2008 election, and let's look at it dispassionately for a second. Let's look at the numbers. It's important to remember that President Obama won not only 90% of liberals, but 60% of centrists and even 20% of conservatives. Hard to believe. He won independents by an 8-point margin. 53% of the vote doesn't sound like much, but it was more than any presidential candidate in 20 years, and more than any Democrat except LBJ and FDR. So you had a country that was sending a pretty decisive message, at least in context of our recent politics. And it was a clear rejection of President Bush's play-to-the-base politics. Both McCain and Obama won their nominations by campaigning against the polarizing play-to-base establishment of their parties. And then, despite American people sending what I think is a clear message, our politics got hijacked very quickly by the extremes in both parties who are invested personally and professionally in play-to-the-base politics. They like it. They profit from it, professionally or personally. And they wanted to perpetuate it by any means